Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you very much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas history. This podcast is being recorded and released in the summer of 2025. I hope everybody has enjoyed their summer vacation so far, maybe taking a road trip or two. We're going to enter hurricane season down here in Texas pretty soon along the coast, so hope everybody's getting their preparations made, although I also hope that we avoid the storms this year. One of the things that we Texans love to do in the summer is take a road trip, whether it's just around Texas or somewhere else. I know growing up we used to go to Colorado almost every year in the summer, and I still do that and can tell when I'm driving up there that a lot of y'all do too. And I've had 2 or 3 questions about a roadside stop on the way to Colorado, so I want to talk about that today. You know, when you get in a hurry, you're trying to get there, a lot of times you won't stop at what are some very interesting places along the way. And then of course when you're on your way home, you just want to get home. But there's one place that I want to talk about today, and it's not in Texas, but it's on the way from Texas to points west, and it's somewhere I think you ought to stop. I didn't stop there for years and years and years. I finally did, and I found out that it actually played an important role in one of the more significant activities of Texas history. So we're going to go back over 1,000,000 years and get wise about Texas. Today we're going to talk about a volcano. And we're going to talk specifically about what's called the Raton-Clayton Volcanic Field in northeastern New Mexico. Now, there were a number of volcanoes around North America millions of years ago, and over time these became dormant, hopefully, but we can still see them today. And if you fast forward from those millions of years to when humans started to show up, about 10,000 years ago, there were people in northeastern New Mexico that scientists refer to as Paleo-Indians who roamed the area, probably looking for Pleistocene bison that lived in the Pleistocene era. Now these are also called ancient bison, and the ancient bison were taller. They had long horns, taller than present-day bison, had long horns. They were about 25% bigger, which means they were about 7.5 feet tall and about 15 feet long, and weighed in the 3,500 pound range. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I want to encounter one of those. In any event, those were the bison that were roaming around, and the people were roaming around. And in this northeastern area of New Mexico, the land was very lush, and those hunters would have been walking around in an area of volcanic activity. And one of the volcanoes that was in that area is now called Capulin Volcano, Capulin. And that's the volcano I want to focus on today. We're going to start in the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, in this area of New Mexico, you had a lot of homesteading going on. You had some mining going on. You had some logging going on. And there's actually a mine pit visible at the base of this volcano still today, and people started to move into the area. But the thing about Capulin Volcano is it is such a well-preserved specimen of an extinct volcano that there was a big movement to protect that land. And back in the 1800s, the way that you did it, it was called withdrawing the land from public entry is the term they used, and what that meant was it was not eligible to be homesteaded by anybody. And that's what they did with Capulin Volcano and the area around it, and that was 1891. In 1906, Congress passed a law that gave the president the power to set aside and protect federal lands that were deemed historically important. So President Woodrow Wilson did that for Capulin Volcano and created the Capulin Mountain National Monument in 1916. Interestingly, the first custodian of the Capulan National Monument, and the custodian was an employee of the National Park Service, was a lady named Jessie Foote Jack, and she served for 5 years from 1916 to 1921. Her husband was a rancher in the area, William Howard Jack, a very prominent rancher. And Jessie Foote Jack was the first female park custodian in the entire National Park Service, so that was significant as well. Now let's jump back in time right quick, talk about another person, Homer Farre, and this is 1907. So this is after Capulan was recognized as a significant site, but before it was a national monument. Homer Farre was from Kansas, and he came to the town of Des Moines, New Mexico, to help his brother-in-law run a store. Homer bought 160 acres just south of Capulan Volcano, and that became eventually the town of Capulan. Now, he bought that land because he greatly admired the Capulan Volcano. He thought it was an interesting site, and he was one of the individuals that worked to preserve it and get it designated a national monument. Now, he was also had town building ideas, as people did when they moved to these rural areas, and he thought that this would be a great spot to bring new residents in and promote the volcano as a tourist attraction, and of course sell some town lots and start some businesses. Farre went into business in the logging industry, started a lumber business. He was the postmaster. He had a newspaper. He generally, obviously, promoted the town that he wanted to be successful. When Jessie Foote Jack left her position in 1921, she asked Mr. Farre, because he was such a significant booster of the area, to take her place. He did officially 2 years later in 1923, when he became the custodian of Capulan Mountain, and he served in the National Park Service all the way up to 1955. In 1925, Farre got the local congressman to arrange for funding for a road up the volcano. Before that, people would just park their wagons or horses or whatever and hike up to the top. Now, I've been to the volcano. I can tell you that is not something that I would want to do ever. So Farre realized if this was going to really be a tourist attraction, you're going to need a road. So he did that, and he got the money, and he built a board road up the volcano and drove the first car to the top on Christmas Day, 1925. The only problem with the road is it was deteriorating the volcano, because you would need to maintain this board road, and it was basically scraping the sides off. So Farre worked for many, many years to try to get road maintenance projects, federal money for those projects. He did so from President Roosevelt, of course, his civic projects all around the country during the Depression, and work continued into the 50s and even 60s to build a more robust road. They also built a visitor center, a couple of residences for the park workers. And interestingly, the road up the volcano, which is a normal paved 2-lane road now, was not paved until 1987. And at the end of 1987, the name was changed from Capulan Mountain National Monument to Capulan Volcano National Monument. Now for a couple of Texas connections for Capulan. The first is a guy named George McJunkan. George McJunkan had been a slave in Texas, and he was a cowboy. That was his trade. So he goes to New Mexico, and he becomes a cowboy and a ranch foreman, learned to speak Spanish, etc. But he was also fascinated, for he became literate in New Mexico. He would break horses and in exchange for reading lessons. He was also a rock collector, a fossil collector, and he was interested in astronomy, and of course relatively uneducated, but interested in all those things. And in 1908, there was a huge storm near the town of Folsom, New Mexico, and it's written that there were 14 inches of rain fell just above the town. And so McJunkan went out to check on the damage, and he found in a small arroyo, he found some bones that had been exposed by the storm. McJunkan noticed that the bones were fairly deep because the arroyo was about 11 feet deep. And so he knew this was going to be an interesting find, and he recognized them as buffalo bones, as bison bones, but they were larger than anything he'd seen before. So they were trying to figure out what these bones were, and it wasn't until after McJunkan died in 1922 that they figured out that these were bones of one of those ancient bison that I described earlier that were a lot bigger. And so everybody was excited. These archaeologists were excited that they were going to get, hopefully, an intact skeleton of an ancient bison. And so they got to digging, and what they discovered, and they found all around the skeleton, were arrowheads that they called Folsom points. I just called them arrowheads. They might have been spear points. I'm not sure. But these were right near the skeleton. So obviously they thought immediately that they had been hunting this ancient buffalo. But what really set them back was they found some of these points intermingled with the ribs in the skeleton, meaning they had been actually thrust into the animal. And one was actually embedded in one of the rib bones. And they knew these giant bison had been roaming the area about 9,000 BC. And what this discovery enabled them to do was realize that there were humans in North America at that time, which back in the 20s was about 7,000 years earlier than they had thought that humans were around. So George McJunkan's discovery led to a revolution in archaeology and a total change in the historical knowledge about the presence of humans in North America. Unfortunately, he had passed away, but that's not bad for a gentleman who had been enslaved and illiterate until he came to New Mexico. The other Texas connection we need to talk about involves a character that you know well, Charles Goodnight. Longtime listeners of this podcast have heard me talk about Charles Goodnight in various contexts. And he is very famous for trailing cattle up to his ranch in Colorado and developing the Goodnight Loving Trail along with his business partner Oliver Loving. They would trail these cattle west, south of the Llano Estacado, across the Pecos River at Horsehead Crossing, and then they would turn them north through New Mexico and on to Colorado. Well, Goodnight used Raton Pass for his trail in 1866, which was the first time that they trailed cattle and blazed the Goodnight Loving Trail. The problem was there was somebody at Raton Pass that would charge a toll for his cattle, and so he needed to find another way to go. So the next spring, he trailed cattle just west of Capulin Volcano and used a pass called Trinchera Pass to get the cattle up to Colorado. And he also used the area around Capulin from time to time to pasture cattle in the winter. So what's interesting about this is before I went to Capulin Volcano for the first time many years ago, I was reading Goodnight's biography, and it talked about how Capulin, Charles Goodnight, speaking to J. Evans Haley, his biographer, talked about the significance of Capulin Volcano. He, of course, called it Capulin Mountain, and how it was basically a road marker for him on the trail. If you think about trailing cattle through basically unsettled areas, you got to have various markers to go by, and Capulin Volcano was one of those for Charles Goodnight. So on a family trip to Colorado, I said, okay, this year we're going to stop at Capulin Volcano because Charles Goodnight did that, and we're going to do that. And we had passed Capulin many, many times. We finally stop, and we drive up the volcano, up the road to the top, and you can actually go into the crater of the volcano. And if you stand up there and look out over the plains where the Goodnight Loving Trail would have been, you can certainly understand. It becomes almost obvious that you would take a herd of cattle around that volcano and north toward Colorado. And if there was nothing else out there, no towns, no nothing, Capulin Volcano would stand as an obvious place to use as a marker for your trail drive. It was a fascinating thing that I really didn't even think about until I got to the top of Capulin Volcano. Well, now we're going to talk about getting there. You get to Capulin Volcano driving from Amarillo on US Highway 87, which is going to take you eventually to Raton, New Mexico, and into Colorado. And about 190 miles or so from Amarillo is the town of Capulin. There are signs everywhere, and you'll see the volcano long before you get there. You take a right, drive a few miles down the road, and you're at the Capulin Volcano National Monument. I encourage you to drive up the volcano, get out of the car, look over there, and think about Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving and thousands of cattle turning toward Colorado at that very spot. It is a very interesting place to visit. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. If you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. Find us on Instagram and X at wiseabouttexas. And go out and do something for Texas today. Until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.